but spills, accidents, and improper disposal mean they still get into waterways. The problem isn't just industrial either. Think of the toxins around your own house: cleaners, paint thinners, pesticides, oil. Improper disposal of just 1 gallon of oil can impair 250,000 gallons of water, about the amount of water in this pool. Agriculture also relies heavily on chemicals like herbicides and pesticides. Their application needs to be carefully controlled to prevent contamination of water. The list of chemicals we use every day has grown faster than our knowledge of how they interact with the environment. Emerging contaminants, a buzzword in water circles, looks at chemicals not traditionally tracked like caffeine, over-the-counter drugs, antibiotics, and disinfectants. A study completed by the United States Geological Survey found levels of many of these contaminants in streams across the United States. Now, the real work begins to see what, if any, effects these chemicals have on water quality. Pathogens are probably the most serious threat to our health. Pathogens are disease-causing bacteria and viruses. They can come from human sewage or raw animal waste. If pathogens contaminate water and aren't eliminated during treatment, the tiny organisms can kill.
One of the real risks that anybody faces who treats water either to drink or, as we do, to make in a condition that can be returned to the river so fish and wildlife can use it and so other people can drink it, is killing certain kinds of viral infections or bacteria. Cryptosporidium is a virus that appeared in the Milwaukee water system about 10 years ago now and killed a number of people up there.
The stakes don't get much higher than that. Knowing what's getting into the water is important, but it isn't enough. The next piece of the puzzle is understanding how it's getting in the water, the basic hydrology or water cycle that picks up these pollutants and moves them into waterways.
A water cycle or hydrologic cycle is the process by which water is transported from the land surface into the atmosphere and then back down to the land surface. And what happens to water when it reaches the land surface, there are a number of different pathways that it can follow. You have precipitation that falls to the land surface either as rain, snow, or ice. You can have some evaporation or water that heads back up into the atmosphere. You can have some infiltration into the shallow subsurface where it replenishes soil moisture. Plants can uptake the water at that point. Transpiration can occur where the water is released through the stems and leaves of plants back into the atmosphere. Some of the water can run off the landscape to a nearby water body, be it a stream, river, pond, or wetland area, and then there's some infiltration that occurs deeper into the subsurface and replenishes our groundwater resources.
During any or all of those steps in the cycle, water can come into contact with pollutants. They get picked up and washed into waterways. As important as the cycle itself are ways we've interfered with it, the modifications we've made over time to the land's natural hydrology. These changes give pollutants a straight shot into water.
Hydrology, or how water moves across the landscape through the underlying deposits, has really changed through time. If we take rural areas, for example, so many acres in Iowa have been tiled, and what tiling does is you're inserting tiles 3 to 4 feet beneath the ground surface, and what that does is it drains the landscape and then funnels the water directly to a nearby stream. So it's speeding up the movement of water off the land surface into a nearby stream.
These agricultural modifications essentially short-circuit or sidestep nature's intended plumbing system that includes wetlands, vegetation, and soil. These natural filters slow down water's movement, allowing more time for pollutants to filter out of the water. It's not just agricultural modifications that short-circuit the system. Urban areas with acres of concrete, steel, and asphalt do the same thing in a different way.
I believe we now have what I call a runoff-driven hydrology. So when rain now falls on a roof, on an asphalt parking lot, on a concrete road, it can't absorb.
Instead of absorbing, water runs over these solid surfaces, picking up pollutants like sediment and oil. The runoff moves back to waterways or flows down stormwater drains, which dump directly into streams and rivers. The last piece of the puzzle we'll look at, the sources of pollutants. Almost any place, anyone, or anything is a potential source of pollutants. That's why water quality experts group sources into two main categories: point sources and non-point sources.
Point source discharges are discharges that come from a fixed pipe. It'd be like a wastewater treatment plant that would be discharging a wastewater into the stream.
Point source pollutants used to be the biggest water quality problem in the United States. The Clean Water Act of 1972 addressed the problem. By laying out strict regulations controlling levels of discharge, the act effectively plugged the pipes. Now, the final frontier for water quality is controlling non-point source discharges.
Non-point, there is no one particular pipe that would be able to be identified as the discharge. It is just kind of an overland flow of the water that goes into little creeks and drainage ways that ultimately end up in the river.
Regulations that worked so well on the point source pollution problem are next to impossible to implement on a case-by-case basis, making the non-point source problem much tougher to solve. So there they are: uses, practices, pollutants, hydrology, sources. I know. You're wondering what that final piece of the puzzle is. Well, stick around. With all these puzzle pieces to consider, pieces that are always shifting and changing, how are water quality problems ever addressed? Good question. One many experts are answering with a powerful tool called the Watershed Approach. It essentially frames individual pieces of a specific water quality problem, providing a perspective on the puzzle. The Watershed Approach narrows the physical scope of a specific water quality problem, allowing experts to isolate and examine the pieces of the puzzle in play: particular pollutants, their sources, the area's hydrology. Let's explore more about this important framework.
A watershed is the land area that drains to a body of water, be it a lake, a stream, a pond, and watersheds vary in size.
For example, the Mississippi River watershed drains 40% of the entire United States. That massive watershed can be broken down into several large watersheds, which can be broken down even further into smaller watersheds, scaling all the way down to areas that may be just a few square miles in size. By narrowing the scope of a problem, it's easier to zero in on the threats to an individual water body and to trace the sources of those threats.
What's going on in the watershed? What are potential sources of pollutants that might be contributing to that watershed?
Knowing the potential sources of pollutants, the different land uses and practices playing out within a watershed, gives everyone a heads up on what pollutants to watch for. Got a lot of farmland in your watershed? Expect nutrients from fertilizers. Industrial development? Expect chemicals. Residential areas? Expect nutrients, sediment, household chemicals. More than just a theory, the Watershed Approach takes a practical approach to solving real water quality problems. Let's look at it in action. Winterset is a small community in central Iowa facing a big water quality problem: nitrates.
Well, nitrates can come from several different sources. In our watershed, approximately 80% of our watershed is cropland. So we're fairly confident that we know it's fertilizer runoff. One option is to put in a nitrate removal addition to our plant here, and it would cost us approximately $800,000 to make that addition. What we would rather do is our other option, which is do work in the watershed to try and solve the problem there. That would consist of constructed wetlands, ponds, buffer strips. We've had modeling done that shows us that with as little as 3 to 5 wetlands in our watershed, we should be able to cut our nitrate levels below the maximum contaminant level. We're a pretty closed watershed, small and manageable. From all indications, once we get these wetlands constructed, we'll see results almost immediately. It's not real high tech, but it's something that's proven to work in the past.
The Watershed Approach allowed experts to identify the pollutant, nitrates, identify the source, farm runoff, and then work with the watershed's hydrology to come up with a solution. Pretty slick, huh? But what if your watershed isn't small and manageable? let's look at the nitrate problem, excess nutrients, playing out on a much larger scale. At the end of the Mississippi River's long journey lies the Gulf of Mexico and the dead zone. The dead zone is a seasonal phenomenon, a huge area where oxygen levels are too low to support aquatic life. Experts believe that excess nutrients, like nitrogen, washing down the river and into the Gulf are responsible for the dead zone. Remember, the Mississippi River carries water drained from 40% of the United States, water that moves through farmland and urban areas alike. With such a large watershed, it's not as simple to pinpoint the sources of the excess nutrients. Most often, the blame is put on farmers.
A lot of people would like to say that the farmers in the upper Midwest are to blame because there certainly have been some concerns about runoff from farm fields. But the issue is much more complex than that. You can't just point your finger at one source. You have to look at the number of people that live within the Mississippi River Basin.
Farmland isn't the only source of nutrients. It's only the most obvious. Lawns, gardens, and golf courses also all use fertilizers.
Certainly, as cities grow, that's going to contribute to more nutrients in the water. You have wastewater treatment facilities that actually convert waste from ammonia into nitrates, and that's legal, and they discharge that into the water. And so if we're going to solve the issue, which we all have an interest in solving that issue, we can't just look at one piece of the pie.
Some proposals ask farmers to considerably reduce the amount of nutrients they use. But if we all contribute to the problem, is it fair to expect farmers to bear the burden of fixing it? A tough problem to solve, especially on this large scale. As the size of the watershed increases, so do the number of potential pollutant sources and the number of competing solutions. Some water quality problems aren't only defined by the borders of a watershed. Political and economic boundaries also shape the problem. Manure management is one of those problems. In big pork-producing states like North Carolina and Iowa, nothing gets folks fired up faster than a good hog lot debate.
Record high nitrates, antibiotics in our water. We've had half the beaches in the state at state lakes closed. We've had a whole series of fish kills throughout the state. Iowans want the issue of water quality and the negative impact of animal confinements on water quality to be addressed.
To some, they're the sweet smell of money. To others, the smell is anything but sweet. Large animal confinements represent a major shift in farming, from small family operations raising a few hundred head to large confinements raising thousands of animals at a time. Critics say the sheer concentration of animals makes the farms major environmental hazards to the air, the land, and, you guessed it, the water. Most of the stink, at least where water quality is concerned, centers on the way hog confinements manage manure, a potential water pollutant. The farms raise thousands of animals, which produce tons of manure. The most common way to manage the manure is to store it in earthen lagoons.
The lagoons can seep into groundwater, and they can spill over, which has happened from time to time.
The threats from storage, the spills and the leaks, aren't the only problems. Farmers use manure as fertilizer for their fields, and whether the manure comes from a large operation or a small one, it has to be applied correctly.
You know, you can be a small farmer and still screw up the groundwater. We know that from history. But the one factor in which scale does make it more difficult to protect the water quality is that when you concentrate a lot of animals in one place, then it becomes economically difficult to spread that manure over enough land so that you don't over-apply it. And that, in turn, of course, is a threat to the water quality.
The more hogs you have, the more manure you have, and the more land you need to absorb it. Over-application results in runoff, which can put two major pollutants right into the water: excess nutrients, or worse, pathogens, both of which are found in animal manure. In Iowa, manure runoff is thought to be a major contributing source of bacteria, which forced beach closings during the summer. So if these operations are such a threat, why doesn't the state just shut them down? Two reasons. The first is money. Hog production has a $12 billion economic impact in Iowa, an impact the state can't afford to lose. The second reason? Not every operation is a threat to water quality. In fact, many farmers are taking the proper steps to protect water, acting as good stewards of our natural resources. Alan Burt and his family run a large hog operation in central Iowa and take protecting water very seriously.
My role as a farmer with the water is, first of all, there's no more water ever being created. What is here is here. And so for me to poison or contaminate the water that runs down through our creeks and rivers wouldn't be a smart thing to do.
Burt says his operation goes the extra mile to keep manure on the land and out of the water.
We try to maintain a small amount of tillage so that our manure doesn't leave the farm. We put up grass waterways, buffer strips. We plant a lot of trees.
All of which are examples of recommended best management practices, or BMPs. Unfortunately, not every farmer uses those BMPs. Because of political and economic influences, there are no simple solutions to this problem. Legislation, regulation, management changes, new technologies, they're all options that could help keep animal manure from threatening water. When it comes to water quality, farms get a lot of the focus, but urban areas contribute their fair share of water pollutants too. All the puzzle pieces are in play. Uses, practices, pollutants, sources, hydrology, this piece of the puzzle is easiest to identify in an urban setting. The shift from grassy natural areas to pavement and asphalt everywhere. Urban resource conservationist Wayne Peterson says that this is one piece of the puzzle we can affect dramatically by employing green development.
The definition of green development that I like to use is development that does not create or add negative environmental impacts. I believe that we will see designs of new development start to incorporate more focus on how are we going to manage water and how is water going to move off of this landscape in a post-development setting.
Peterson envisions a return to a more natural hydrology for urban areas.
Having water moving through the system properly in a sustainable way is kind of the foundation of an ecosystem. And if you've got a bad foundation on a building, it's probably gonna crumple over time. And if you don't manage water properly, which is the foundation of the ecosystem, I believe all other aspects of that ecosystem will tend to unravel. I know we're not going to turn the whole world back into prairie, of course, but I do think we can understand how water might once have moved through this natural or native ecosystem. And I think we can design new developments that will mimic the way that landscape functioned, even if it doesn't look like it once did.
Knowing which piece of the puzzle to target to create the greatest change can have the greatest effect on your problem. Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, you. Individual responsibility for water quality is the key to solving this puzzle. Awareness of the problem isn't enough. It's only when that new knowledge is put into action that we'll begin to see a difference in our water's quality. An idea these kids have taken to heart. They're the Environmental Club from Davenport West. Their city sits on the bank of the Mississippi River, but they monitor nearby streams, checking for nitrates, phosphorus, and the water's general health.
I was curious to know how Iowa's water, like how clean it was since we're drinking it.
The club reports their results to a statewide citizen-based group monitoring water's quality.
It's really important to get involved in this sort of thing, and most people, they wouldn't think of doing something like this, people our age, to know that I'm doing something that helps the environment. It's a good feeling.
It doesn't matter where you live. Don't just sit there, make a splash, get involved. Identify which pieces of the water quality puzzle are in play, then take action. Change a personal practice, monitor a stream, educate a neighbor. It's up to you, the most important piece when it comes to solving the water quality puzzle. program was funded by the Roy J. Carver Charitable Trust, the U.S. Department of Education Star Schools Program, and Iowa Public Television.
The correct and proper use of pesticides is vitally important to all of us that are involved in this industry. Whether you're a private applicator that's applying pesticides to your own farm, or you're a commercial applicator that applies pesticides for the public and charges a fee. Today we want to discuss briefly the history of pesticides, look at the laws and regulations that apply, look at labels and label comprehension, safety. Then we'll look at pesticide groups, formulations, and the environment. But to begin our discussion, let's take a look back and get a little bit of a perspective on pesticides and where we kind of got started. First, we need to identify what a pest is. As most of you know, a pest can be any type of organism that affects man and his crops. So that could be insects, or it could be diseases such as fungi or bacteria. It could be rodents such as mice or rats, or it could be even other forms of wildlife damage like birds, and of course weeds. All of these are pests, and it's according to what crop we're looking at. As far as pesticides go, you can go way back in history. The children of Israel used salt to desiccate the land before they took it over. In 900 AD, the Chinese first began using arsenic as an insecticide. And then in the mid-1850s, pyrethrums were discovered. They are botanical insecticides derived from chrysanthemum flowers, also lime and sulfur. But really what got us into the pesticide age came out of World War II and all of the research that was done then. Prior to World War II, in 1939, DDT was discovered by a Swiss entomologist and then was widely used during World War II. Toward the end of World War II, the organophosphates were discovered, and so that, along with a lot of other discoveries, really put us into the chemical age as far as agriculture goes in the post-World War II era. Now, let's describe what is a pesticide. A pesticide is a chemical substance that is used to kill or control pests. And as you can see here, there are a lot of different types of pesticides. Pesticides is the general term that covers all of these. An insecticide is a form of a pesticide. A herbicide is a form of a pesticide. As you see what I mean here. Fungicides, rodenticides, there are several. Plant growth regulators are considered pesticides, defoliants, and desiccants. Now, let's turn our attention now to the laws and regulations that govern all of the use of pesticides. In 1947, Congress enacted the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act. We just simply call it FIFRA. FIFRA has been amended several times. In 1972 it was amended, in 84, in 1988, and then as recent as 1996 with the passage of the Food Quality Protection Act. But the purpose of FIFRA is to regulate the distribution, sale, and use of pesticides. And as you see there on the screen, the pesticide definition that we gave a little earlier, FIFRA has 34 sections, and we won't go through all of these sections, but you can see here short title and table of contents, definitions. The law lines out training, the training that you're going through to get a private applicator license here today or a commercial applicator license is lined out in FIFRA and so forth. But let's take a closer look at three sections. Section 3 Section 18 and Section 24C that you'll need to know for the examination. Now, Section 3 is what's called a full registration on a pesticide. That means that the pesticide or the chemical company has performed all the tests that are required and gone through all of the jumping through the hoops for EPA, and they agree that it can be labeled and that it can be sold under the terms of the label. Section 18 is what's called an emergency exemption label. And these are for just that, emergency situations. They're time limited and very restrictive. An example of this may be if we have an outbreak of a certain caterpillar on cotton and we don't have a good control for that, there might be an insecticide that is being tested and has not been labeled yet, and we can petition EPA for an emergency exemption to allow the use of, let's call it brand X insecticide, and use it for maybe 2 weeks to control that particular caterpillar. But it's an emergency exemption. The other section that we want to look at, or labels, is we're talking here, Section 24C, which is called a special local needs. This permits a state to label registered, federally registered pesticides for some uses that are not on the label. An example of this would be like a herbicide, like gramoxone, for instance, is currently labeled on, say, peanuts, but we may petition and get a special local needs to use the herbicide gramoxone on sweet potatoes in Alabama. And these labels last for several years, about 5 years. But you need to know that, a Section 3, a Section 18, and what a Section 24C is. Now let's turn our attention to the Alabama Pesticide Act of 1971. The main purpose of this state law is the same as that of FIFRA. It does, however, contain two provisions within it. The Custom Applicator Law, which regulates the custom application of pesticides by aircraft and ground equipment. And as you can see here, there are several categories: demonstration and research, ag plant, forest, right-of-way, aquatic, and so forth. And then there's the Professional Service Law, which requires licensing of those in pest control work in and around structures, lawns, sods, and ornamental plants. And you can see these categories here. Again, both of these categories, the Professional Service Law and the Custom Applicator Law, apply to commercial type pesticide application. As you can see in the Professional Service Law here, we have ornamental, turf, pest control, industrial, institutional, and household. That's for your pest control operators, and then there are others. But the Alabama State Department of Ag and Industries is the state government agency that oversees this law, and they also issue your permit when you complete the test, either as a private applicator, and private applicators are those of you that are farmers applying pesticides to your own farm, or commercial applicators. Let's turn our attention now to to a regulation that we need to be aware of. This particularly for farms is called the Worker Protection Standards. And Worker Protection Standards was added by EPA in 1992